How's it going, Dave from Comic Book Investments? So, the one thing I really love about comic books is I love the art. I love art. I love going to museums in, either here or in other towns and going in the museums and seeing all the cool art, different things. I went to the Getty not too long ago. That's in LA, so it's a couple hours from me. And they had a showcase of old books from, I don't know, they're probably from like the 1200s, 1300s through probably like the 16, 1700s. And back then, obviously, they didn't have the printing press, so everything had to be hand drawn. And so each book was hand written out in big, thick books. And in them, they would have the most beautiful art because they would have the writings and then they'd have art along the side. It's almost similar to like a comic book, except it was more focused on the on the writing than the art. But sometimes you'd open a page and it'd just be a full, like drawn picture, and each one individually drawn like that, and just like so cool, so beautiful to look at. They also had a bunch of other paintings and other stuff, but I love the art of comic books. That is like my favorite thing about comic books, probably. So I figured, what are my favorite comic book artists? And there are so many, so many, and I would know a lot more than probably the average person just because I deal in golden age, while most of you maybe never seen that many golden age comic books. So I come across different artists. I'm like, wow, that's really cool. So I have like a golden age artist on my top five, and most of you probably never heard of him. But I really love his art, and he was only in the comic industry for a very short time. But there's so much like cool artists out there, and it's hard to narrow them down. But what I do when I try to make this list is I try to narrow them down. Like when I see a piece by said artist, like how does that make me feel? What kind of emotional reaction do I have when I see something like that? Now, obviously, some artists, either degrade over time or they get a little worse or they have some bad covers here and there, bad art in general. But what does it invoke in me? And what just catches my eye, makes me feel something. So I kind of narrowed it down. Now, this is not an exact list, but I tried to find the artist, and I'm sure I'm missing someone out there, and I'm just going to be like, oh, I'll make this video, and then like a month later, or someone put in the comments, and like, what about this person? I'm like, oh, I totally forgot. So it's really hard to like, because there's so many off the top of my head, but I made a list of my top 5 favorite. So it's going to be, it's not in any order. I'm just kind of putting it in no really particular order because it's so hard to narrow it down because each artist makes me feel something different, and it's hard to say like, oh, is this feeling better than this feeling? So I'm just going to go off this list. So first up, it's not fifth or not first, Bernie Wrightson. So when I see Swamp Thing 1, I don't know why. I'm not even the biggest Swamp Thing fan. I like Swamp Thing, but something about the way it's drawn, I just love it. I just love it. And I love that 60s, late 60s, maybe even creeping into early 70s, like horror stuff. His line art is just so good. I'll have like images flashing back and forth, but his line art is just so good. I love like just even his pencil drawing. It's like a pencil and ink. He did like this Frankenstein monster book. It wasn't a comic book per se, and it's just the way he draws. It's very Frank Frazetta. Very Frank Frazetta. Like I see Bernie Wrightson as like an extension of Frank Frazetta, but in like more horror, while Frank Frazetta is more sci-fi and fantasy. But it's very eerily similar in ways, just the way it looks. But the way he does horror, it's so appealing to look at. Now, here's the thing. I was born in the mid-'80s. So Bernie Wrightson wasn't really even that popular in terms of comic book artists during my time growing up. So the comic book artists I would have grown up with would have been like McFarlane, Lee, Liefeld. Those, because that's when I was like a kid, and those were like the really popular ones. So Wrightson wasn't even like a thing, really. So, but when I see these old comic books and going back, it just invokes something in them, and it's just, it has this nice sense of like creepy but dreariness that I just love to look at. And just even down, sometimes a lot of artists like they really need the inker and the colorist to bring out their art, but not with Wrightson. It's like both with his color and inking on it versus just the sketch version, both have the same impact, but a different impact at the same time. They're both good emotional responses if he just does a black and white one. So yeah, love Bernie Wrightson. Next is, I'm butchering his name, Bill Sienkiewicz. That's how I say his name. This is always hard for me to say his name. I don't know why. But anyways, his art is so just weird that I love. This is the type of art that I love, or love like hanging on a wall. Just kind of out there, especially his 80s stuff. I love his 80s stuff. Like his Dazzler. I'm not a big Dazzler fan, but like his Dazzler stuff, it's less like painted masterpieces like Leonardo da Vinci or Michelangelo or something like that. I just love the weirdness of it. I love how his art doesn't have to be proportionate, right? One arm could be longer than the other, one leg could be skinnier, and it just like looking kind of weird, not proportionate. But to me, that is art. And the colors that they end up using on his artwork, and just like the overall design, it just looks like something you would hang on a wall. Especially his 80s stuff, like his Dazzler stuff. It's just kind of out there and so weird. And it just like when I look at his 80s Dazzler stuff, I just look at that and I go, that's the 80s. Like it's weird. I just look at it like, that's the 80s. He just really encapsulated that time. And his other stuff is great too. I'm not just saying the 80s stuff, but all of his stuff is just, I love the weirdness of it. I just love the weirdness of it. The kind of outside the box thinking, not traditional line drawn, stuff like that. Next we have is Moebius, and I'm trying to say his French name, Jean Giggle. I think that's how I say it. I read up how to pronounce it. I think that's correct. But Moebius, he did like some Silver Surfer, but he more does. I have a couple coffee table books of his artwork. He does like these like fantasy sci-fi, just showcase coffee table books of his art, and it's just the simplicity of it. And the color palette that he uses, it's this. I just love to look at it. It's just so simple, yet it's so intricate at the same time. And there's so much going on. And his use of colors in his art, it just brings this to life. And it's like looking at his art, I instantly know that it's his. And that, as an artist, is probably one of the best things that I think anyone can say of an artist, right? It's easy to say someone's good, this is good, even music. But when you look at someone, you go, I know who that is, right? I know exactly who the artist is. It's the same as like hearing a song. If I heard a song by a particular artist, even if I've never heard the song, it's just the way that they stroke the guitar, the way the way they arrange certain, like, oh, this chord to this chord, this chord to this chord, the different chords they use, just things like that. I'm like, oh, that's so-and-so. I know. And that to me is the greatest compliment, because that means that from the test of time, that person has found a style. And that is so hard to do as an artist. Trust me, I don't have style. But it would be a great compliment. So when it's a Moebius, I mean, all these artists I just tell, but that means that they're top tier. It's like in this tell, and it's just great to look at the simplicity of it. It doesn't need to be intricate. It doesn't need to have a lot going on, but it still emotes like a nice, relaxing emotion. All right, next we got is a golden age guy. I think he stopped around in the 50s, but he left comics. A lot of old golden age artists left comics to do like commercial art, because that was like, now you used to use computers to draw up like a Pepsi ad or something like that. But back in the day, someone had to draw that. If you wanted like, a Sears catalog and you have a Christmas special and you had Santa Claus on it, well, guess what? You had to draw that Santa Claus. Like, there was no just going out. I mean, I guess you could. Photography wasn't as good back then, but I guess you could still do. But a lot of time they're painted. Like, look at old magazines, old like advertisements, things like that. They're all like painted or drawn in some capacity. So a lot of these old comic book artists left to commercial because there was more money in it than in comic books. Anyways, we have Matt Fox. Now I didn't know who Matt Fox was until I started this business, and Chilling Tales came across my desk, and it is so weird. I don't even know how to explain it. There's a children's book called Where the Wild Things Are. I don't know. I think that's what it's called. I never read it, but it's almost like whoever did Where the Wild Things Are literally is copying Matt Fox. It's a very similar type drawing, very similar. But anyways, Matt Fox, he wasn't in comics very long. He did pulp novels, came over to comics for a little bit, and then went back to pulp novels, and then went into commercial art, and kind of stayed there and just didn't really do much in that regard. But it's a very unique style. As soon as you see it, you know who he is, and which is very nice for back then. There wasn't that many comic book artists, and a lot of them were just copying other artists. So to have your own style back then was much more, I guess, unique. But yeah, it's just so weird looking. It's almost like I can't look away. I look at it, and it's Golden Age. It's a little more simple of art, not that intricate. But I look at it, and I'm just like, so weird, just weird. And that's all. It just evokes like this weirdness feeling into me, and I just can't seem to shake it. Maybe it's the fact that he didn't do that many covers, that much art, so it's rare for me to see, and I just like it every time. I don't know. Maybe if he's like a regular artist and did thousands of covers or something like that, maybe I wouldn't feel the same way because it's not as rare, and I would see it all the time. And this is just like, your book after book after book. Whoa, this is weird. But if I saw, over and over and over and over again, it kind of normalize it. So maybe that could be, but I've always kind of liked his art. Can't really explain why. I just find it so weird to look at. Maybe it's because he's done just a few books. But before I get into my last one, and I'm sure maybe you guys could guess, I'm going to go through some honorable mentions just because I felt so bad leaving some people out, and I can't. So these are in no order either. This is just the order I just remembered to write them down. So Jim Lee. I think Jim Lee perfectly draws comic book characters, superheroes. He is like a perfect artist in terms of comic book characters. So just drawn to perfection. Proportions are correct for a comic book character. Just gets better over time. He just draws amazingly, especially his Batman. His Batman is amazing. I think he's gotten better since the 90s, personally, but he's a great, great artist all around, just a perfect comic book artist. If you could basically put into a machine, AI, and say, make me the perfect comic book artist, Jim Lee would pop out. Next is we got David Finch. Now, David Finch is basically Jim Lee, but on steroids. He's this Jim Lee, but let's turn it up to like from a 10 to like a 15. Just very good artist, but just way more grit and grime to his art. Next is we have Alex Ross. Alex Ross it's just beautiful to look at. His paintings, the way he can draw, the way he brings realism to his characters like they are actual real life. They're like, this drawing of Superman feels like this person exists. A lot of times it is because he takes a picture of a model and then paints over, like kind of like uses that model as the inspiration for his art. So a lot of times these people do exist. But it just feels like, it feels real. Next we got Frank Frazetta. I mean, he's just a classic. Such a great artist all around. He never really wavered. He did sci-fi and fantasy mostly, paintings. Just a fantastic, knew how to draw the human anatomy in such a good way, in such a good style that most artists couldn't ever dream to be as good as him. Next we got is Matt Baker. Now, if you want the original OG drawing sexy ladies, Matt Baker is your guy. Now, unfortunately, he died very young. I think he was like 31 or 33. He had a heart condition, and he died. And this is also back in like 40s or 50s. Probably didn't have that good of medical science. But he's the OG good girl art. He did The Phantom Lady, which a lot of people said it was over-sexualized back then, so he had to tone it down. But when he came into the office of where he ended up working, he showed someone a sketch of the female form, and that person hired him on the spot, and he's like, in all my years, I've never seen anyone draw the female form better than this guy. And that was when he first started. He was probably like 18. And I believe he was even gay, so which makes it even weird because he would look at, he would look at the female. He wanted to specialize in the female anatomy, but so he would look at it from a different angle than maybe a straight man would. So it was very interesting indeed. I also think he was the first African-American artist, if I'm not mistaken. I'm trying to go off of memory, but I believe he was also the first African-American artist. But in any case, his female form is amazingly drawn. And that brings me to the next one, who Dave Stevens, he kind of looked at Matt Baker's female form, and he was like carried the torch afterwards, even though Stevens was probably 22 decades after. But he would look to Matt Baker as inspiration on how to draw. And Stevens is also a fantastic way of drawing the female form, just very beautifully drawn. So very nice to look at. That's what I have to say. Next is this guy would probably be in my top 5. It was just hard to make this list boil down. But Asad Ribic, I love his style. It's kind of like a watercolor style, which I really love. I mean, I have a whole Gambit piece right here that's basically the same as that. And just the color palette that he uses, almost like these pastel muted colors, just so appealing to look at. I've had a couple of Asad Ribic pieces in my time, just some pages and stuff like that. He doesn't do that much, probably because it takes him a lot longer, but gorgeous to look at. He would definitely be in my top 5. I mean, there's an argument made he is in my top 5. Neal Adams. I love Silver Age Neal Adams. He is like the Jim Lee of the 60s. Perfectly drawn, really set the tone of this is how you draw a superhero in the 60s. Like, this is it. This is what they look like. This is what Batman looks like. Just got that beefiness to him, that grit to it, just well drawn, perfect, encapsulates what a superhero should be drawn like. Jim Steranko, like I mentioned this before, but in the early days, a lot of times you'd be drawing a said character and they bring on a new artist, and the publisher, like Marvel or DC, would like kind of keep drawing it how the last person drew it. So if you look at like Spider-Man, he was always kind of drawn the same. Like artists would have a little bit of interpretation, but not too much. They always kind of look the same. And then here comes Todd McFarlane in the late 80s, and he looks drawn completely different, just way different than you ever seen. And it was just like a shock, right? It's like, whoa. And a lot of times publishers would just want to keep the same kind of very similar, draw them very similar, just because they didn't really, I don't think they would let the artist be art, like the art of the artist. They kind of just let them like, hey, we're making, this is a product that we're making money off. We don't want you to put your spin on it. We want to keep things the same. So for decades, people are reading the same Spider-Man. And it wasn't until like probably the late 80s, early 90s when they're like, let artists just do whatever. And that's why art just looked way different in the 90s compared to like the 70s and stuff like that. Every character looked different because each artist would put their own interpretation on it. 1670s very toned down in terms of artist interpretation. And I feel like Steranko was the only real outlier in that, where he could be that different interpretation of art just slightly in the era that he was in. It was more like a pop art thing, bringing his own aesthetics to it. Then last is we have, well, last of my honorable mentions, Johnny Craig. He just does all the horror covers that I love looking at. I mentioned how I love looking at all the old horror covers. They're just during an innocent time when they're just so brutal and people's heads getting chopped off. And it was just kind of like just a breath of fresh air compared to like, you know, this simplicity and the childlike of the other comics around that time. So on to my last one of the top 5, but kind of, I guess, number 1. I don't know. His name is Mark Simpson, but he goes by Jock. And he did this cover, Detective 880. When I first saw this, I was like, wow, this is like me. This is me. This is like the style up. It's very similar to Bill Sienkiewicz in that it's all weird. And I love Jock's art. I have a bunch of coffee table books of his art. I just love to look at it. I mean, I love it so much I got it tattooed. Even this is very similar to something he's done. I don't know if he did this. This is from a movie poster, but very similar stuff he's done. And I even got it tattooed on me. That's how much I love this guy. I think he's just phenomenal. I hope one day to get this piece. I just love that style, the style that he does. It's not perfectly drawn proportionately, and just use of big, bold lines with little lines. Just very, I don't even know the word I'm looking. This is called polka trash. That's the style of this, but it's kind of similar to that. Just kind of all over the place. That all these lines shouldn't make sense, but when you put them all together, it creates a picture that you just love to look at. And the simplicity of his colors, not overly colorful, just very simple, basic colors. Yeah, I just love his art. But that's it. That's my top 5. Let me know in the comments below who I forgot, because I obviously forgot someone. Now I can't throw everyone on this list. It'd be a mile long. But show me some of your top 5. Tell me some of your top 5s and why you love them. Have a great day.